The identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most widely debated mysteries in true crime. Over the course of just over 2 months, in 1888, a serial killer brutally murdered 5 women in the Whitechapel district of London's East End. In the 130-ish years since this horrific crime spree, there's been much debate over which other murders might be attributed to the Ripper and who the Ripper was. The lineup of suspects includes Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria, American doctor Francis Tumblety, and renowned artist Walter Sickert, amongst others. A lesser-known suspect on the shortlist of Ripper candidates is Frederick Bailey Deeming, an English-born Australian murderer who was so loathed across 2 continents that some news reports claimed over 10,000 incensed citizens lined up to witness his execution. The monster that was Frederick Bailey Deeming first became known to the world when police were sent to investigate a putrid smell emanating from 57 Andrew Street in the Melbourne suburb of Windsor. On March 3rd, 1892, 2 officers sent to investigate the home unearthed the decomposing body of a 30-year-old woman beneath a hearthstone of a bedroom fireplace. The corpse had been doubled up and jammed inside a small hole, then covered with concrete before being hidden beneath the stone. A post-mortem investigation revealed that the victim's head had been severely fractured by several blows from a heavy object, and her throat had been cut. The only clue to the woman's identity was found with the last tenant to occupy the cottage on Andrew Street. A local butcher named John Stamford let the home to a man named Mr. Droon, who paid a week's rent in advance. Mr. Droon complained that the walls of the house were full of nail holes and told Mr. Stamford that he intended to repair them with cement. The new tenant was rarely seen by neighbours, but one recalled witnessing Mr. Droon leave the cottage in the company of a lady who appeared dressed for a night at the theatre. Several weeks later, Mr. Stamford arrived at the house to collect overdue rent and discovered that it was empty, with no clue as to the whereabouts of Mr. Droon. Following the harrowing discovery of the corpse, investigators used luggage tags recovered from the empty home and information about the previous tenant gathered from local tradespeople to trace his arrival back to the Kaiser Wilhelm II, a German steamship that arrived in Melbourne on December the 15th. The description of Mr. Droon matched that of a passenger listed as Mr. Albert Williams, who travelled with a woman named Emily, presumed to be his wife. The passengers recalled Mr. Williams as ostentatious, boastful, and loud. This public persona made it easier for the police to trace him back to another flamboyant character who had boarded a vessel bound for Perth on January 23rd under the name Baron Swanston. Notably, the Baron was travelling alone. An arrest warrant for the Windsor murderer, operating under the aliases of Williams or Swanston, was issued, and on March the 12th he was arrested at Southern Cross, where he was employed as an engineer at Fraser's gold mine. By the time he was returned to Melbourne to stand trial for the murder, his true identity, Frederick Bailey Deeming, was known, and investigators were piecing together a troubling timeline that crossed 3 continents. Deeming was born in Leicestershire, England in 1853. He was known in his neighbourhood as Mad Fred, a child so difficult that his own mother was known to say he was born to be hanged. At age 16, Deeming ran away from home to begin a life at sea, where he quickly learned to make money through thievery and cons. By the start of the 1880s, he had returned to the UK, where he married a woman named Marie James in February of 1881. The pair moving to Australia in 1882, where they would eventually have 2 children. Deeming found work in the gas and plumbing industry, mainly working in Sydney. Perhaps surprisingly, he was considered a good worker, at least up until he was found guilty of stealing brass fittings. For this crime, he was sentenced to 6 weeks in prison, returning to gas fitting work as soon as he was released. In 1887, he found himself in trouble with the law again on charges of fraudulent insolvency, with the punishment for this likely being longer than just 6 weeks. Deeming fled New South Wales with his family while out on bail. Being a family on the run, it's no surprise that the timeline gets a bit fuzzy around this point. It's believed at some stage they returned to England, where Marie gave birth to their third child. But between 1888 and 1889, they also spent time in Cape Town, South Africa. Whilst there, Frederick was involved in a diamond mine scam that seemingly landed him in a fair amount of money. It's stated that his brothers back home learned he was once again returning to the UK, this time with a considerable fortune. A fortune, but apparently not his family. It seems that either before or not long after travelling back to the UK, Frederick and Marie appeared to have become estranged. This may explain his reported behaviour on the journey back to England, as it's said that Deeming flaunted money and jewellery and was lecherous towards female passengers. Once in England, Marie settled in Birkenhead while Frederick rented lodgings in Beverley near Hull. There, he went by the name Harry Lawson and pretended to be a wealthy retired sheep farmer. With this persona, he began a relationship with his landlady's daughter, Helen Nellie Matheson. Oblivious to her beau's real identity and the fact he already had a wife, Nellie and Harry were married on February the 18th, 1890. Shortly after their honeymoon, Deeming fled from Hull, taking the gifts he had bought Matheson with him. It appears that one reason for his flight was that he had been orchestrating another scam at a jeweller's in the town. From Hull, he made his way to Birkenhead, where he met with Marie. He gave her a large sum of money and told her he was going to travel to South America and send for her and the children once he was established there. Transatlantic travel was not a fast process, however, and by the time his ship had arrived in Uruguay, his crimes had caught up with him and he was promptly arrested and sent back the other way. For this crime, he received a 9-month prison sentence. After his release in July of 1891, Frederick leased a home called Denham Villa in Rainhill under another false name, Albert Williams. The lease was supposedly for his friend, a Colonel Brooks, who was due to arrive from India shortly. While awaiting the Colonel's arrival, Deeming, or Mr. Williams, stayed at the lavish home himself. When a woman and her children were seen at the home, they were explained away as simply his sister, nieces and nephew paying a short visit. This was obviously Deeming's own wife, and by this point 4 children, but they apparently didn't stay with him long, as he soon began another quick relationship, this time with a woman named Emily Lydia Mather, the daughter of a local well-respected shopkeeper. Just weeks after his release on September the 22nd, Frederick, as Albert William and Emily Mather, were married. The following month, the pair boarded the Kaiser Wilhelm II, bound for Australia. They arrived on December the 15th and began renting a house on Andrew Street in Melbourne. Though she couldn't have known, Emily's fate was sealed. When Deeming was arrested for Emily Mather's murder in Southern Cross, police were shocked to learn that just days after killing Emily, Deeming had advertised through a Melbourne matrimonial agency for a wife, preferably 19 to 20 years old. But he ultimately didn't need the ad to find a new lady. During his escape from Melbourne, He met Kate Rounsfell, a young woman suffering from a bout of illness on board the boat he was travelling on. He tended to her under the guise of Baron Swanston and promised her wealth and happiness if she agreed to marry him. Plied by luxurious gifts, she agreed to the engagement and vowed to follow Deeming to Western Australia, where he had obtained a position at a mine. The Tuesday before his arrest, Deeming wired Kate £20 for boat fare, and she arrived in Melbourne with her wedding trousseau. Thankfully, before she boarded the ship bound for Perth, Kate saw the newspaper articles about the search for Swanston and contacted police to share what she knew about the supposed Baron's location. The arrest of Frederick Bailey Deeming quickly made global headlines, and as dots were connected across oceans, a single question emerged. What happened to Deeming's first wife and children? It didn't take long for investigators to hear about the mysterious visitors at Denham Villa, whom Deeming claimed had left to join the woman's husband in Port Said. Shortly after their apparent departure, Frederick, acting as Albert Williams, had complained that the drains at Denham Villa were in need of repair, and the floor in the kitchen needed to be dug up and replaced. This work was closely overseen by Deeming. With this in mind, behind locked doors and covered windows, police in Rainhill began examining the floors of the villa. It didn't take long for a sickening, unmistakable smell to emerge from the home. On March the 16th, 1892, beneath the newly laid kitchen floor, Marie Deeming and her 4 children, 10-year-old Bertha, 7-year-old Mary, 5-year-old Sydney, and 18-month-old Leela, were found in a state of advanced decomposition. An inquest into the murders revealed that the 5 family members had likely been killed in late July of 1891. Marie and Bertha had been strangled, while the other Deeming's throats had been cut, in some cases so severely that they were nearly decapitated. At the time of the murders, Deeming was courting Emily Mathers and making frequent trips to Birkenhead to reassure Marie's sister that all was well. When he vanished several months later, Marie's relations assumed that the family had resumed their nomadic lifestyle, perhaps returning to Africa or Australia. But shortly after the bodies were uncovered, Marie's sister identified the victims, leaving no question as to Frederick Deeming's brutal nature. Now, with 2 horrific crimes involving the cutting of throats to his name, Deeming quickly became a favourite in the media as the possible identity of Jack the Ripper. The same day the news of the Rainhill killings was reported, newspapers began running pieces speculating that Deeming could also be responsible for the 1888 Whitechapel murders. Not only was the manner of death the same, cutting the throat, but Deeming's whereabouts in 1888 were largely unknown. He was seemingly flitting back and forth between England and Africa, and without Marie's testimony, there was no telling exactly where the family had been and when. Was it possible that he was killing women in Whitechapel? After his arrest, he was transported under guard to Perth via train. At each stop, crowds of angry Australians waited for a chance to glimpse the killer and hurl obscenities at him. Once in Perth, investigators took inventory of Deeming's travelling trunk, which was found to contain possessions belonging to Emily Mathers, along with photos of Marie and his children. Extradition was granted, and on March the 27th, Deeming was moved again to Melbourne. The crowds across the country were so massive and angry that he and the police guarding him feared an attempted lynching. The planned route had to be altered several times to avoid some of the larger crowds that could easily overpower the authorities. On April the 2nd, Frederick Bailey Deeming was formally charged with the murder of Emily Mathers under the name Albert William, as he refused to admit even now his true identity. His defence argued not guilty by reason of insanity, but 6 doctors testified that after examining him several times, they could not unequivocally state that he was insane. Deeming claimed to have contracted syphilis in London and said since becoming ill with the disease, he had been receiving visits from his mother's ghost, who urged him to kill. A prison physician testified that Deeming had told him that on several occasions he had gone out with a revolver in hand, searching for women who may have given him the infection. Against the advice of his lawyers, Frederick took the stand in his own defence. His speech was rambling and often unhinged, with the accused claiming at one point that Emily Mathers was still alive. But before long, Deeming found his old boastful stride and spoke for over an hour, exalting his own adventures and condemning everyone who slighted him. The impassioned speech did not sway the jury, at least not in the way he may have hoped, and they quickly found Deeming guilty as charged, and he was sentenced to death. As the condemned awaited execution, rumours about his possible connections to the Whitechapel murders continued to swirl in England and Australia. An American couple even visited his cell days before he was hanged and asked to make a plaster cast of his right hand, hoping that the lines in his palm might reveal his true identity as the Ripper. In London, Madame Tussauds Wax Museum recreated the kitchen where the bodies of Deeming's first wife and children were found, and soon after displayed a life-sized effigy of the killer. Later, there would be rumours about Deeming confessing to at least 2 of the Whitechapel killings while in prison. In some versions, he confessed his crimes to other prisoners. In others, he told investigators himself that he had killed an additional 2 women in Whitechapel, but was ignored because police believed he was trying to stall his execution while inquiries were carried out. Regardless, the supposed confessions did nothing to halt Deeming's date with the gallows. He was hanged on May the 23rd, 1892 in Melbourne. According to some reports, as many as 12,000 people gathered near the prison and in the streets to celebrate his death. Frederick Deeming spent his last few days before his death penning an autobiography of his life, but it was destroyed following his execution, along with any insight into the Ripper cases that it may have contained. The information that the investigators were able to gather about his fragmented life across the globe led them to believe that he had been imprisoned or in Africa at the time of the 5 canonical Ripper killings in 1888, and he was summarily moved to the bottom of the list of suspects for the world's most famous unnamed killer. But in recent years, renewed interest in Deeming as the Ripper has emerged, and it is now believed that Deeming may have been in England at the time of the killings. The theory hinges on a few key similarities between Deeming and the Ripper. Jack the Ripper has long been believed to harbour a pathological hatred of sex workers, consistent with someone suffering from neurosyphilis. Likewise, Deeming had told a prison physician that he had sought revenge on London sex workers for his syphilis diagnosis. One of the Ripper's victims was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman whose mutilated body was found in the early morning hours of September the 30th, 1888. The last known sighting of Eddowes was at 1:35 a.m. when she was seen talking with a fair moustached man. The description certainly matches Deeming, whose large moustache was so notable that he plucked it out hair by hair during one of the overnight stops on his journey to Melbourne to stand trial. Plus, a young dressmaker positively identified Deeming as a man she knew as Lawson, who courted her in London at the time of the Ripper murders. According to the dressmaker, Lawson had an obsessive interest with the Eddowes murder and a prominent fair moustache. Like the Ripper, Deeming preferred to kill by cutting his victims' throats. But the Ripper was also known for using surgical dissecting knives to mutilate his victims. While that was certainly not the case with the murders Deeming was known to have committed, a Melbourne jeweller claimed that shortly after Deeming arrived from England, he asked the man to clean a pair of blood-stained surgical dissecting knives. In 2019, a paper published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences claimed that Jack the Ripper's identity had finally been proven through DNA analysis. The authors of the study used a shawl belonging to Ripper victim Catherine Eddowes to tie the crime to Polish barber Aaron Kosminski. But it didn't take long for the findings to be thoroughly trounced by the scientific community. There is no proof that the silk shawl tested ever belonged to Eddowes, nor that it was worn the night of her murder. The garment had passed through the hands of collectors for decades and was handled by dozens of people, including the same descendants of Kosminski, whose DNA was used for comparison in the study. The true identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown, and while many believe that Deeming is a good fit for the crimes, the chance of anyone definitively being declared the Ripper 130 years after the murders are slim at best. One thing is irrefutable. Frederick Deeming was a monster of a man whose horrific murders of 2 wives and 4 children make him every bit as loathsome as the Ripper who haunted London's East End. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, "Well, I never."